I want to start by giving a little bit of background of John. So John Leonard is currently serving as a senior scientist at 3T BioSciences. It's an immuno-oncology startup in San Francisco Bay Area, which is involved in developing T-cell-based therapies for solid tumors. Prior to this, John was a postdoc fellow at University of Chicago, where he studied how regulatory T cells discriminate self from foreign material in the context of autoimmunity and cancer. So while in Chicago, John also worked in Polsky Innovation Fund, conducting scientific and market due diligence to support investments in new technologies developed at the university. He received his PhD in biochemistry from UCSF for his work in the molecular mechanisms of nucleosome positioning by ATP-dependent chromatin remodelers. John is also the creator of Graduate Debris, and we're really looking forward to to know more about the Graduate Debris, which is a resource blog for grad students and postdocs covering topics like academics, personal finance, and career exploration.
Great. Yeah, so I mean, what I thought I'd do is take you through a little bit in more detail through kind of my background, the kind of career journey, the path that Harinder described, and tell you a little bit about my kind of situation thinking, and then also some sort of lessons, things I've learned along the way that I thought might be useful to know if you're going through this setting yourself. And then I'll talk a bit more about what my role looks like in my current position at a startup. And yeah, talk about kind of some other projects I have going on and any other questions you might have. So as Harinder mentioned, I did my PhD at UCSF in San Francisco. And there I worked on, in the field of chromatin, working on these molecular motor proteins that do lots of interesting things like restructuring and reorganizing nucleosomes. So, very interesting from a kind of technical mechanism standpoint. It was a question I could really go deeply into. And I got, tremendous mentorship while I was there from my mentor. So just to kind of paint a picture, overall, I'd say, grad school, I enjoyed pretty well, had challenges just like everybody else does, research doesn't work or, the normal stresses, but overall, things went pretty well. But I think, maybe midway through graduate school, I started thinking a little bit more about what comes next. And in getting into graduate school, I think I kind of made the kind of automatic choice to go and get a PhD. I think it ended up being a fine choice for me, but I'll admit fully that I wasn't completely aware of kind of what else was out there, right? So I had seen, in undergrad, I enjoyed doing research. I was enthusiastic about science, and all of the people that I had seen, kind of the role models I had along the way, were graduate students and postdocs and professors, right? All those people who had taken that one career track. And so that was the model that I had for what a successful career in science looks like. And so, right, for that reason, the PhD was kind of the automatic choice. And yeah, but so it was probably, third year, something like that, where I started thinking about, do I envision myself in this job? And there were some aspects that I really, thought I would enjoy about being a professor, but other aspects, things like not having control over where you live, regionally speaking, things like having to worry about securing grant funding and even the process of getting to faculty positions, right? The ultra competitive kind of job markets and all these things. Yeah, I think, at some point I was maybe started entertaining the idea of different positions, but I realized I didn't really know what else was out there. And so I was fortunate enough to be at a place like UCSF that was a part of maybe a dozen or so schools at the time, and I think it's expanded to more, universities who have received funding from the NIH to develop career development programs for graduate students. And at the time, UCSF's program was called GSICE, and this was a series of seminars much like this one, but also kind of intensive workshops and things like this to teach you how to reach out to people, show you what types of careers exist, prepare you how to interview for positions, things like that. And through that, I got exposure to things like, industry research in a more detailed way than I had before, but also things like management consulting, which is something that I hadn't really considered before, but it definitely piqued my interest. Right. So I think toward the end of graduate school, I was somewhere, thinking, maybe 80% of me wanted to do something other than academia. There's maybe 20% of me holding on to the thought of maybe I could make it work. Being a professor can be interesting. And so, yeah, before I go on to my postdoc, I think I'll kind of reflected on a little bit, what were some of the things that I some lessons that I've learned, or things that advice that I would give to people, going through their PhD now. I think something that was really influential, it really influenced my trajectory a lot, or really, helped facilitate my transition through graduate school, was choosing a PI who really prioritizes mentorship. This is, not even necessarily related to the idea of career exploration, but I think this is super important. And if you're in a lab and you've realized, that your PI maybe doesn't have time to mentor you in the way that you'd like, then seeking out additional mentors. I think that's super important. That projects can come and go, but having someone who's there who can kind of help shepherd you through it and help ensure your development and growth as a scientist is really important. This is another one. So applying for fellowships I found to be a really helpful exercise, and even as someone, I went on and did a postdoc. I'm working in science, but I think even for people who are not, if you think you might want to go into something that's more business oriented, having a fellowship I think is beneficial for a number of reasons. One, I think it helps, anything you can do to help you with communication and being able to communicate science clearly is super valuable experience, especially if you're going into fields that are more outward facing, like a business oriented profession. Secondly, it's a tangible thing that you can say, look, there was this competitive thing that I achieved, and there's a dollar amount attached to it. There's a certain amount of prestige. So having that as like an item on the CV, especially if you go out, somewhere where maybe your publication record is less important than other things, this is a tangible thing that is valuable in your CV. So both from the technical side of skills you gain and for your own development and professional skills, I think applying for fellowships is really important. This was a big one for me. That this third point was something that I grappled with. I literally had a professor say to me during grad school, like, you like science, right? And you're pretty good at it. Then why would you be anything other than a professor? And like that to me, just something about that just rubbed me the wrong way. And I think that was the challenge I had. It was like, I felt like, I'm not terrible at this. Like, why is it stupid to walk away, right? A lot of people really want this job. But I think that it's important to be honest with yourself and recognize, what is it that gets you up in the morning? What is it that excites you? And also, what is it that will give you the other things that you want, out of your life, out of a career? And if being a professor isn't one, know that there are other ways that you can use your training in science, other places where you can still even do science, do really great science, that don't necessarily have those same limitations as being a professor. So this one, I think, for anyone out there who might be feeling like, oh, I'm doing okay at this, like, should I consider it even though I don't want to? Like, you can still love science and not want to be a professor. That's okay. And then finally, just like Harinder said, kind of as soon as possible, try to learn what other careers are out there. Even if you think you know what you want to do, it's useful to know what other options exist. You also might think and then find something else that's a better fit for you. And I would say that that's even important. This kind of learning what other career options exist for PhDs is even important, even if you're 100% positive you want to go into academia. And I don't know how many people attending the seminar are in that camp, but the way I think of it is if you want to be a professor, someday you will be training graduate students and postdocs of your own. And knowing what career options exist for them outside of academia is one way to really be a supportive mentor. And to help train them, help to give them the skills that they need to succeed. When the reality is that the majority of PhDs won't go on to do the same job that the professor does. So yeah, super important, I think, regardless of which career path you take. And I'm happy to talk more about this later. This is a little maybe out of it's maybe not sequentially in order with my kind of career trajectory here, but I think Harinder mentioned that financial tips, personal finance for PhDs, I think is something that I've thought a lot about over the years, and I've realized that there's kind of a need there. First, I want to normalize the fact that surveys have shown that more than half of graduate students report at some point feeling stressed about money, and I'm sure if you go to high cost of living areas, that I'm sure that number goes up. And it's something, I think money is something that doesn't get talked about a lot in academia, but the reality of it is that by choosing to go to graduate school, we are making a financial sacrifice, right? If you look at, friends or colleagues in other industries, right? There's a gap between how much you're making as a graduate student and how much they're making, and that accumulates over time, right? And so there is a financial cost of going to graduate school. All that said, of course, there is like, more long-term earning potential, and there are other things like job satisfaction that obviously come into play. But I think the money is a factor that should be discussed. I think more than it is. So in terms of like Harinder said, trying to make the best of the situation that you're in and make those cents really count. I think the first tip that I would give to people is track your spending and make a budget. And there are plenty of free tools available for this. I think the kind of most commonly used one is mint.com, where you can sign up and have it sync with all of your financial accounts and say, okay, where, what is my money coming in? Where is it going? And even just, being able to see that visibly makes a huge difference in terms of understanding how much you have to work with and where you might be able to save for things that you want to do. Second point that I think is super critical is that in your 20s and 30s, it's like the best possible time to start saving for retirement. And I know it seems like it's really far off, and maybe the idea of like investing sounds complicated or like sketchy to some people, right? But this is it's a very standard thing. And again, if you consider the cohort of people that didn't go to graduate school, your friends who are working at for a tech company or any type of company, right there, maybe without even knowing it, they're saving for retirement, because a pretty common practice is having money taken out of your paycheck every month to go into a 401k, which is a retirement investment account. So this is something that is kind of done automatically in a lot of other careers, but as PhDs, we don't necessarily have those mechanisms built in, and so we have to take more active, participate more actively in that. But the good news is, right, if you start early, the money that you contribute, like I said, in your 20s, has the longest time to grow. And so it's just, even if you only have $50 or $100 a month extra on top of your budget to put into a retirement account, that makes a huge difference over time. And again, your PhD, right, if you're spending 5 years somewhere, $50 a month, $100 a month, that'll add up over 5 years. So start thinking about those things early. This is maybe a pretty specific one, but for people who might be on fellowships and things, look at your paycheck each month. If you don't get taxes taken out of your paycheck, then you are responsible for paying estimated quarterly taxes. And hopefully your universities talk to you about this, but that is an important point. And then this is maybe less pragmatic advice, but more just philosophical. I would say we as a field, I think, should acknowledge that it's okay to factor money into your career decisions. And I would maybe even say the converse, right? It's like, it's silly not to consider that as one of many factors that might impact your career decisions. I know in academia, I think people like to treat money like it's this forbidden topic, right? Like you should be happy to do science for low wages indefinitely because of the joy of science. But ultimately, right, it's a real thing that has real implications for your life and your family and things moving on. So being okay talking about money and not feeling guilty for considering money as one of the things that impacts what career it takes, I think, is advice I would give. All right, so back to me, back to my kind of career trajectory. So as Harinder mentioned, after my PhD, I went to the University of Chicago. So my decision there was, to go there was twofold. One was that my wife got into graduate school in Chicago, and so I knew I was geographically restricted looking in that area. And secondly, again, at the end of my PhD, I was interested in industry. I thought something other than academia, most likely industry research. Again, possibly a little consulting, who knows? But so with that in mind, I thought, okay, with this next step with my postdoc, how do I go about making myself the best candidate possible for those kinds of jobs that I'm interested in? And so with that in mind, I thought, I started looking to see what jobs out there, what I might be, in industry, what my existing skill set might get me. And I saw that, there were some gaps, and some of the positions I might be best qualified for maybe weren't the most exciting to me. And so what I decided was I wanted to get expertise in a field that was more kind of directly relevant to things going on in industry. And so I chose, started reading a lot and got really excited by this idea of cancer immunotherapy, the idea of rather than to treat cancer, rather than drugging the cancer itself, developing drugs or treatments that activate the immune system and letting the immune system kill cancer, which is something it naturally is capable of doing. And so that, caused me to look at, I ended up joining 2 different labs at the University of Chicago. I was co-mentored by Erin Adams, who herself was a biochemist and structural biologist. So that was kind of familiar territory for me, but working in a new field. And then I worked also closely with Pete Savage, who himself is a mouse immunologist. And so, yeah, that experience, I think, I was able to hit the ground running with some of my background in biochemistry, but then ultimately learned a ton by jumping into a new field. And as Harinder mentioned, part of what I worked on, for those who are interested, it was identifying the targets of regulatory T cells, which are these special type of T cells that are, rather than attacking something, they actually suppress immunity. And so the idea is that they recognize parts of your autologous, your own proteins and things like that, and tell the immune system not to attack autologous tissues. So yeah, super interesting from a scientific perspective. Did all the things that one does during a postdoc. Applied to fellowships, published some of my work. Struggled with science and all that entails. But additionally, I came into my postdoc again, as I said, pretty intentionally with the intention of professional development, right? And so I was really involved in 3 different organizations pretty heavily while I was at University of Chicago. One of them was the Postdoctoral Association. So we, coordinated seminars and speakers and that type of thing. The other one, this program, My Choice, was University of Chicago's version of that NIH-funded career development program. And My Choice was pretty expansive. They covered everything from seminars and mini courses and things like, the business of science, how to run a lab for people interested in academics. And they, they also sponsor things like internships, which I didn't participate in, but they also had, I took a trip with them to Boston where we got to visit a handful of biotech companies. And so that was super, super cool to be able to see inside some of these companies, talk with people there. So really, really fruitful experience there. The last experience, maybe the most unique one, I think, that I sought out was this through the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship, which is through the business school. They have this thing called the Innovation Fund, which is a small venture capital fund, so an investment fund that invests specifically in new technologies that come out of the University of Chicago. And so if a lab develops a new molecule or a new device or something, not even just in the life sciences, could be any field, they might go to this fund for early investment money. And what the fund does is they take a PhD or postdoc, a law student and a business student, and put them together on this multidisciplinary team where you do what is called due diligence, which is to try and figure out, is there a market for this thing? Do they have the capacity to patent what they've discovered? And what does the landscape of other patents in that field look like? And then ultimately, is it scientifically sound, right? Is it backed by other evidence in the field? Does their primary data look encouraging? And the ultimate goal then of that is to try and understand, does this thing have what it takes to become a product potentially, or a drug, or whatever the case may be? And that is something that I've been, started getting interested in grad school, and have obviously continued an interest in it now, is the idea of what it takes to get from this idea, right, this proof of concept you have on the bench in a lab at a university somewhere, to a drug that is able to treat patients, or to a product that's able to be out in the world and accomplishing something. All of the steps that it takes to get from A to B, I've always found kind of pretty interesting, and there's a lot that has to go on scientifically and otherwise. And so that, I think, really influenced my career trajectory as well. From these experiences, ultimately, I waffled back and forth on whether to do something like consulting, but I think I was still a little hesitant to leave being directly involved in science. And for some people, I know people who took the other choice, who took the other option, went into consulting or things that are more business oriented, and that could be the right choice for them. I think for me, I'm pretty happy with the choice I made to stay closer to the science. May transition, elsewhere at some point, but for now, I think it's a good fit. And so, but this did influence me in the sense that I was really intrigued by these small companies for a number of reasons, and I think I'll get into that a little bit later. So let's see where we are. And Harinder, again, feel free to interrupt me if there are questions that come up.
Sure.
So before I get to,
I think there's one question we can take it right now. So it says, you mentioned consulting a few times. What does consulting entail in science business context?
Yes. So consulting, broadly speaking, well, so yeah, so when I say consulting, I typically mean management consulting. There are other types of consulting. Some management consultants, a business, and it could be, let's say in the context of life sciences, right? But it could be in any industry. A life sciences consulting firm might say, a life sciences company developing drugs might say, hey, we're considering going into this new market, maybe looking into cardiovascular diseases. Like, is there a market for that? What else is out there? Does our current research strategy mesh with that? They might bring in an external firm, like consulting firm, where and consultants will basically tackle whatever problem, whatever kind of problem and project that is needed by the company there. So, I gave that's one type of example, but really there are a number of different kind of tasks that they can do. And so the idea is you're kind of working on a project basis, solving problems in industry. I know it sounds super vague. Again, I'm not a consultant myself. I have some friends who have gone that direction. I think that it can be a range of projects. But yeah, the idea is basically you're like a professional problem solver, right? The client will come to you with a particular task or question or problem, and you will propose a solution. And it's usually very, it's very intense. It can be a very short time scales where you have to like turn things around very quickly. Traditionally, there was a lot of the big management consulting firms relied a lot on travel all over the place. You'd be flying around a lot. That probably is toned down quite a bit now. Hopefully that maybe gets a sense. And so, when I said consulting, depends on where you go, kind of what you'd end up working on. I know some people who went to certain firms where you really have to be a generalist. And so even though they're trained in biology, let's say, they might be working on, working for projects with a bank or with an oil company or with a nonprofit that's doing education or any number of things right outside of their field. Other firms, be they big or sometimes these smaller, what are called boutique firms, may allow you to focus on just one particular industry. And so, I know some people who went specifically to a firm that only does life sciences consulting. And so there you might be, specifically focused on manufacturing challenges that people have in terms of how do they make the drug or how do they get their supply chain of ingredients, right, to come to the right place at the right time. But so all of these tend to be with more of like a business focus. And so there's a whole spectrum in terms of what you could do, whether that's in the life sciences industry or not.
So John, I may reach out to you to ask for suggestions on consulting. This is something we've been planning for some time. So
absolutely.
Yeah. We have another next question, which is also very relevant by Marketa. She says, you mentioned how you were unaware of other career options there were for you outside of getting a PhD before you started grad school. What knowledge do you know now that you wish you could share with your younger self about these other career path possibilities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, I think I wish I had taken, I suppose a lot of people would say this in a number of industries. I wish I had taken some kind of computer science or basic coding classes earlier. I think that the flexibility of having that skill set would be useful. But more broadly, in terms of what kind of possibilities exist, so I think there are a number of options. Like if you don't have a PhD, certainly you can, I know people who have, and we have people at my current company who came fresh out of undergrad and are working, a lab research position in a company like this. Some people might stay and just, do that for long term. Some people might do that for a couple of years and then decide to go to graduate school. So that kind of research track is still open to you. But I will say without a PhD, there tends to be kind of a cap on how high you can rise in the purely research track. And certainly the development is slower there. So that's part of it. I think there's also kind of a number of other positions that, require some understanding of science, but are not purely research-based themselves. So for example, our chief business officer, the person who does business development with us, has a bachelor's and master's of some science, biochemistry or something like that. He himself is not doing any science day to day, but he is negotiating with, pharmaceutical companies that might want to do research collectively with us. And he's still attending our lab meetings and seeing the data we're presenting, and he's up to date on those things. So having an understanding of science, but going into something that's more either with a business focus or marketing focus within a larger company, let's say. Those are options that I think don't necessarily require a PhD. Certainly there are people in those roles, and depending on the company, there might be a different precedent for it. But yeah, and I guess I don't mean that to say, if I had known about these, I don't know that I would have chosen any of them for myself. But just to acknowledge that, it wasn't a fully informed decision that I made to go to the PhD track, right? It was kind of I jumped in, ended up working out, I think, okay for me and being a good fit. But yeah, I know people for whom, that maybe wasn't the case, and they realized partway through that, oh, maybe I wish I would have done something else instead. So good to be aware as aware as you can of kind of what else exists out there as much as possible. And I'll get to some tips about how to find that type of thing out, because I know it can seem like a big black box all the time.
All right, thank you, John. These are the two ones we had. Go ahead. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so we'll keep going. Yeah, and so this kind of in the same vein as tips for grad school, some tips I had kind of through my postdoc. This is actually getting to the topic I was just talking about, where, in the same way that it's helpful to know before you go into a PhD what other options exist for you and informed decision. I really think the same should be true about a postdoc. For a lot of people, a postdoc is the right move, right? It gives you more kind of in-depth training and experience being somewhat more independent as a researcher. And so if you're going into a research-focused position, that is really excellent training for you. Right, in other cases, there's maybe a case to be made that in some cases, out of convenience, postdoc can be useful. But I think that said, the additional training, additional in-depth training in science is not great preparation for consulting, right? It doesn't help you become better at patent law or other, these other career options that where it's useful to have a PhD. A postdoc may or may not be the right move there. And so I would really encourage everyone, if you aren't a postdoc, like that's, obviously that's fine. Try to be as proactive as you can and make the best of the situation. But if you are early in graduate school still, try to be thinking about these questions now. And so try to explore as much as you can what else is out there. And really, I think the goal should be to shift kind of the career exploration from the postdoc, which I think is where it falls for a lot of people, earlier into the PhD, to where you can really make an informed decision and say, yes, I want to do a postdoc because it's the right move for me for these X, Y, and Z reasons, as opposed to, I graduated, I'm going to do a postdoc because that's what you do next. And then 3 or 4 or 5 years into your postdoc, say, great, now what do I want to do as a job, right? So I think that's shifting the mentality on that. I think would be really beneficial to a lot of people. Yeah, so if you do decide that a postdoc is the right move for you, I would encourage you to be just upfront and honest about whatever your career interests are with your potential postdoc advisors, whatever that may be. So for me personally, I went into my postdoc interview saying, hey, I'm fairly certain I want to do a research position in industry. There's a possibility I might want to stay in academia, but pretty much I'm probably thinking industry. I know for some people that might, make you uncomfortable. You might think like, oh, what if that rubs the professor the wrong way? What if they aren't supportive of that? And to that, I would say then you probably don't want them as your advisor. If they're, because the way I think of it is a large part of your mentor's role during your postdoc is to help you get to your next career position, right? You're doing a lot more research independently on your own, and so the support you get from them on the science side will be less and less. And then really what becomes important is can they help facilitate connections with people in whatever your chosen field will be? Can they help you get the skills that you'll need to get there? And if your advisor is like, people who go off into industry are just falling off into the void, and I don't really care about them, and whatever, don't let the door hit you on the way out. That's not going to be a person who's going to really help develop you professionally during your postdoc, and probably not someone you want. And again, if you find yourself in this position and you've kind of realized after the fact, seek out those additional mentors other professors in the department or other people, people who are currently in the field that you're interested in. Try to find those mentors to fill that gap. Yeah, so then kind of in the same theme of making it an intentional choice, I think I would encourage everyone to view the postdoc as a time to actively engage in your professional development. So I talked about how I wanted to gain new techniques and experience in a new field. I think also this should be viewed as a time to continue exploring your career options, make connections in the fields that you might be interested in, and doing things like intern or consult. And so right, these kind of tangible, practical, hands-on experiences with whatever field you might be interested in. When I say consult here, I mean more, I wish there was better terminology, less management consulting and more like, there are some cases where a company might want, so yeah, for example, a company might want help from, someone who does bioinformatics to work on a project basis. And I know of situations where that's happened where, someone who's still in their PhD might advise on a particular project where they have a unique skill set or something like that. So any sorts of experiences that you can have that kind of connect you with those industries and give you more of a flavor for what it looks like and help you build those relationships, those are really helpful. Right, so figure out what you need in order to get to that next step, and then try to build that into your postdoc. And I'll just make a note that, right, even if you're on the academic track, all of these points still apply, right? So during your postdoc, you should be looking for what can I do now that will prepare me to be more successful, both in securing a professorship job, but also in running a lab, right? So looking for mentorship training and workshops, looking for workshops on how to run a budget, how to run a lab, things like that, how to write a K99 or these other transitional awards or R01s, things like that, that'll be really important for your next position. Seeking out those training opportunities is important. Okay, so yeah, towards the end of my postdoc then, I guess it was again kind of spurred by something that was outside my control, and that was that my wife matched for her clinical psychology internship back in San Francisco. And so we knew that this was coming, so I had published my paper, was just kind of waiting. And as soon as I found out, basically started applying. And what my search looked like then was, again, looking in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I knew at this point I wanted to work for a small or mid-sized biotech company in the area of cancer immunotherapy. And I'm happy to take questions about, I know Harinder mentioned the difference between large and small companies. Full disclosure, right, I have only worked for a small company, and people's, I think, answers to these types of questions are always somewhat biased toward their own experience. But I can tell you why, I narrowed my search to those sizes. For me, from talking with lots of people who worked for various types of companies, I knew that I was really interested in being in a place where I could make an impact on the science that was happening and on the direction, the scientific choices that were happening. And so that's certainly more likely to be the case at a small company. And also, from this kind of entrepreneurial side, I was really interested in beyond just my role, in early, discovery, exploratory research, beyond that, kind of what it takes to get from there to a product. And so I was interested in seeing more of the other functions that happen within a company. And again, from talking with people, I get the impression that you're able to see more of the entire process at a small or medium-sized company than you are at like a big pharmaceutical company, where you might be, given a particular subject area or a particular domain where you can go, really deep in that area, but you may not, once you complete your portion, you may hand it off to someone and not necessarily be involved in all the downstream steps. And of course, there are pros and cons to both of those. Happy to talk more about that from my experience anyways. But that was my choice. And so just to give you a sense of what the interview process looked like at that time, and we can talk more about how this may have changed during COVID. But this was about 2 years ago. So my interviews, I would send out, feelers, either apply online or reach out to people at the company. Companies that were interested would call back and schedule a phone screen. So this would be a short, maybe 15-minute call, either with human resources. And so this would be a non-scientist. This would be someone who is familiar, at kind of a buzzword, keyword level, what's required for the job, and also trying to weed out any kind of, jerks, I guess, at an early stage and see whether you're, on paper qualified for the position. A couple places were like that. I think for some of the smaller companies, more often they don't have a huge HR department, so you're more likely to talk directly with the hiring manager. And this just means the person on the scientific team who will be your boss if you get hired. Right, so it's someone who has deep scientific, knowledge in whatever it is you will be doing, and you ultimately will report to them. So that initial phone screen is just to gauge, like, are you, directionally the type of candidate that we're looking for? Do you largely check the boxes? And then there may be one or several additional phone calls with either the same, with the hiring manager or with other scientists on the team, to get a sense of a little bit more deeper kind of background, sense of your understanding of the field or your experience, that type of thing. And if all those things go well and they're interested in you, then ultimately then they'll schedule kind of the full interview, which is, these days more likely to be a video interview, but at the time I did in-person interviews. But I think the format is still largely the same. So these, for PhD level hires, they'll consist of an hour-long seminar, very much like an academic seminar or like an academic job talk, where you'll present for an hour on your research and field questions from scientists at the company. And then in addition to that, you'll have a half day up to a full day of one-on-one interviews where you're talking with other, again, scientists from that department, maybe from adjacent departments, people with whom you might interact and who have an interest in the position, or an interest in the person being hired into this position, right? People you might work with. Yeah, so just, timeline for what my personal job search looked like. February 26th is when, I got the word from my wife that we're going to San Francisco. And so I started outreach at that point. Over the course of, I guess, the month of March, I had, a bunch of phone screens and interviews like that. And then as soon as, for me, again, since I was applying in a place other than where the job was, right, I had to take a trip out to do these in-person interviews. As soon as I got one, I basically let the other people that I was talking with know that I would be out there. And then it's a pretty low bar for them to say, okay, we'll bring you in since you're going to be here anyway. So took a trip, I think for about 5 days out to San Francisco. So, a month after I started, I came out for interviews. Week and a half later was when I got offers, and shortly after that, I accepted an offer. And so just to sum it all up, right, I took one trip out, had 3 formal interviews, 2 informal interviews where I didn't actually do the seminar portion, and ultimately got 4 job offers from this.
So John, we have one question, which is like really relevant to the timeline and the process of applying. So Lauren wants to know, could you speak a little bit to like how you went about physically finding companies that you were interested in working for, which is a really good question. And
great question.
And the second part is how you made that initial connections with these companies, that is applying to the posted career opportunities, conducting informational interviews first, cold calling companies, etc. Really good question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it preempts some of the tips that I'll give here. Yeah, and so I think, yeah, so the initial question of how, sorry, was the first question, how did I find the positions?
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's, companies? Yeah, how did you, yeah, exactly. Which company?
Yeah, so,
yeah.
So I think one thing you can do is read, and again, all this should be ideally before you're even ready to apply, right? You want to kind of lay this groundwork and get some familiarity with this before you're actually actively looking for a job. If you're looking for, biotech or pharmaceutical, especially if you know like roughly what disease area you're in, you're interested in, or maybe even if not, start reading news in that field. So there are some websites like Fierce Biotech, Fierce Pharma, Endpoints is another one. These are all kind of news organizations that specifically report on biopharma industry news. And so if you, check that once a week or every day or something, just read and scroll through, you'll start to see what companies come up, interesting things that are happening, just getting a feel for who are the big players in the field. That can be helpful. And then honestly, if oh, I'll be looking in this region of the country or in this field, just, search through jobs, right? Look through LinkedIn, read job descriptions. That can give you a really good sense of, at this particular company, what title would I even come in at? And that can be different across companies. Some people, a PhD level hire is called a scientist. At some, it's a senior scientist. Can be very, very different things. And you know, within that job title, there could be many different types of positions, right? One might be a really good fit for you, and one might be not so much. So, yeah, I would say, you know, reading news to find companies you might be interested in, but also searching on like LinkedIn jobs for positions, and just reading through what types of skills they look for, what the job description entails, is a really good way to get a feel for it. Was there a second part to the question? Sorry.
Yeah, it was just about like once you figured out this is a company you want to work for, how did you go about
Oh, and how do you reach out?
contacting
Yeah,
people?
so that's a
Like
great,
different steps. Uh-huh.
Totally. And I think, you know, this props to this question, who asked this question. I think you hit on a number of the points that I wanted to give as takeaways here. Yeah, I think the take-home message is you're way more likely to get full consideration for a position if you have some sort of personal connection. And by which I don't mean you have to have like a friend at the company, but like how the process works. And I can speak to this now from the other side, even at a small startup, right? These, from our perspective, right, the applications are coming into like a shared email account that people have like shared responsibility of like checking, or maybe the one person hiring the position might check it, but basically each day you might get 10 or 20 or 50 applicants, right? And so you're scrolling through this email account, maybe clicking on a handful of resumes if they seem relevant, but it's like really easy to miss candidates there, right? It's hard to make, since we're all doing this, right? If we're hiring for a position, we're doing that on top of our job of like doing research in the lab and managing people and all this stuff. So it's always this like thing for time. And so anything you can do to increase the amount of the amount of time that you get for that like initial first look makes a huge difference. And so for myself personally, I did a number of things. So I applied to kind of job boards online. I think I've never heard back from a job where all I did was apply online, which is pretty telling. The places where I did get connections would be, you know, what I would recommend is you're like, ooh, there's a position at this company. They're really interesting. Go on LinkedIn, look at people at that company and look for people who maybe went to your same university, either for undergrad or grad school or postdoc. Look for really any like initial connection. And honestly, if you can't find that, maybe just message someone and say, hey, here's my background. You know, maybe we have this thing in common. I'm really interested in hearing more about your experience working at this company. And this is a concept called an informational interview, which is, yeah, basically just having a conversation about someone, wanting to hear about their experience, how they got to where they are, and what their current, you know, job experience looks like. This is something you can do long before there's like a posting. Again, it's maybe best if you can do it ahead of time, so that you build this, you know, relationship beforehand. But that's also a way you can learn about the company, right? So that's one of them. This kind of like cold reaching out, saying, hey, we have this in common. Can I hear about what, you know, I'm really interested in this company, be interested to hear about your experience. Maybe through the process of that conversation, it might come up, oh, there's a position, or at the end of the conversation, you know, you could bring that up. I also, you know, for someone where I couldn't find this person on LinkedIn, I actually ended up guessing their email account, and that one led to an interview. So a lot of email addresses are like first name, last name, or first name dot last name, or first initial dot last name. There's like a finite number of combinations, and so you could guess people's email addresses sometimes. But then, yeah, the other kind of really powerful way, I think, is if you do have a personal connection. So LinkedIn is also really good for this. You can search for people at a particular company, and if they're like a second degree connection, see who you have in common, and, you know, ask them if they can make an introduction. Those are also really helpful. Yeah, so hopefully that, I think, answers that question. I think anything you can do to give yourself a personal connection means that, you know, I'm much more likely to give, you know, 20 or 30 seconds or a minute of initial consideration to something where my coworker says, oh, hey, this person reached out to me on LinkedIn, here's their CV, it might be relevant, versus, you know, the fraction of a second that I'm taking scrolling through all these applicants in an email account. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that was perfect. So there are a few more questions, but maybe we can wait for them until the end.
Yeah, let me, I can breeze through some of my, some of the stuff. And I just want to, you know, I can give you a little update on kind of my current position and the other stuff I'm doing, then I'm happy to take more questions. So I won't go into, I had some scientific slides. I won't go into too much detail, but as Harinder said, I'm currently at 3T BioSciences. We're a small company, right now 15 people. So this photo is a little out of date. And we work in the field of, ooh, that's animated. We work in the field of cancer immunotherapy. So broadly speaking, trying to develop engineered cellular therapies against novel targets to treat solid tumors. And happy to talk more afterwards, or can send out information on the company. It's 3tbiosciences.com. But I won't go into the science too much just for the sake of time. Yeah, so here's what my role looks like, right? So when I joined the company 2 years ago, there were, I think, 7 or 8 people other than myself. And so really, they had a technology platform that came out of a university, and some of the first hires were basically trying to scale that up to an industry scale platform. Downstream of that kind of basic assay, they needed a whole bunch of cellular assays, right? So verifying some of the kind of initial results in T cells, and doing a bunch of kind of T cell biology at that point. And so basically when I came in, it was okay, we need a bunch of, we need to be able to do these things in T cells, go. And so, I had to learn some things I was familiar with, some things like, lentivirus I had never worked with before. And so it was figuring out, okay, these are the key things we want to be able to do. We want to be able to do a high throughput assay where we look at peptides' ability to activate T cells. We want to do primary cell isolation, and we want to be able to do, X, Y, and Z other things. Figuring out what is the best approach to do it, what materials and equipment we might need, and then building those out, troubleshooting assays, getting a protocol up and running, and then ultimately training other people to do that work. So this is probably one of my favorite things about joining a really small company is you, yeah, I just had the opportunity to say, okay, here's a problem, get creative, try to figure out what the most scientifically rigorous and fastest way to solve it and to address this question is, and then build it out. So that's been really encouraging. And so it's still establishing new assays and then generating data on some of our existing workflows. And in addition to myself, I also manage a team of 2 to 3 people, depending on kind of priorities month to month, doing most of the T cell work that's happening at the company. And so these, people with a range of different experiences, experience levels. Other responsibilities I have are presenting at company meetings. These are things like, data presentations, but also updates on progress on various projects. They, as a small company, I feel like my opinion is also taken into account on things like critical feedback on data that others are presenting, as well as like the overall scientific strategy, right? What approaches should we be using? What rationale should we be using for picking targets that we want to go after, or things like that. More recently have been, again, there have been opportunities that come up to, if I see an opportunity where like, hey, we should be moving in this direction as a company, I can propose a new project, with here's the methodology we should use, here's what the budget would look like, here's the timeline, and if I get approval, then basically make it happen. And that's been super cool to be able to do that. Again, I think opportunities that you're maybe more likely to come by at a smaller company. It also comes with challenges, right? So we're not at a company with huge existing pipelines. If we wanted to do mass spectrometry or what have you, right? That's if it's something we don't have expertise on in-house, we have to figure out how to either outsource it or like build it ourselves. And so it's also, there's some challenges associated with the small company as well. I also manage an external research collaboration with an academic partner. So we fund, some of the work going on there, and in exchange, we, might, publish papers with them, and we get some data in return from them, which is interesting. And then also being a startup, there aren't people to do some of the organizational or administrative tasks. And so things like figuring out how we should organize our electronic lab notebooks, or what nomenclature we should use for storing samples or data, or taking out the trash sometimes, right? There's a lot of other things that kind of entail. So it's wearing a lot of different hats in my current role. And then, yeah, I don't have to spend too much time on this, but in the last couple of minutes, I'll just talk, I'll give a little shameless plug for this side project that Harinder mentioned. Started this maybe toward the end of last year, and it took a little bit of a hiatus, and now I'm trying to get back up and write more. But basically, having talking at events like this, and being pretty engaged with trying to share with people kind of what things I've learned along the way. I decided that wanted to create kind of a repository for all of this. And so this site, graduatedebris.com, written a bunch of articles. And so actually some of the topics that we've touched on, I've written kind of longer articles with advice. So things like how to get a job in industry, and also some pretty in-depth guides for saving for retirement, and other topics in personal finance. So yeah, this is, I would call it a side hustle, except it's not in any way designed to make money. So it's more of like a passion project. It's information that I think is really important, where you know, in some cases I think there's kind of a dearth of resources for people on the PhD track. And so I'm hoping to make this a free resource for people who have some of the same questions that I had going through everything. And with that, it looks like maybe 5 minutes left for questions. I'm happy to stay a little bit over as well. So feel free to ask away.
All right, thank you very much, John. This was very informational. We loved it, and you know, it was really nice that you covered many different topics, including the money part. Now, I have a couple of questions which are directly related to what you just talked about your company. Quickly, how many do you have postdoc level people in your company? Since you did postdoc, and this question comes up all the time: is postdoc necessary or required to get into industry, research, or other industry positions?
Yeah, great question. Do we have postdoc level people? Yes, we have a mixture of people who did a postdoc and who did not. The startup situation is a little bit, maybe not the best example, because I think it's very situational, who ends up getting picked for what. But broadly speaking, I think, do you need a postdoc? My advice that I give to people on that is, if you know the type of position you want in industry, bearing in mind that there are some positions where you might do the same thing over and over again, and maybe, you know, less room for creativity, whereas there might be some roles where you have this more creative license to run things. If you know kind of what field and on that spectrum, what type of position you want, and you're able to get it out of grad school, I would say go for it. There's very seldom a kind of career like level bump for the experience you gain in a postdoc, which I think is a bit of a shame. There are some companies who adjust for that, right? Who might bring you in if you have a fair amount of postdoc experience, might bring you in a little bit higher. But ultimately, you know, if you can get to that position with just a PhD, I would say give it a shot. The reason I see for doing a postdoc is kind of a silly reason, that basically you're competing for positions with some people who have postdocs, right? And so the additional experience, maybe managing more junior scientists, the additional experience in additional techniques or other fields, like all of that, you know, might make these other people a more competitive candidate. And so for that reason, right, you might just find that if you apply for these positions, maybe you're not considered as much as someone with postdoc experience would be. So I think there's no hard and fast rule. I think, you know, my advice to a lot of people is try both, apply to both, and see what you get, and see what seems more interesting to you. All
right, that's interesting. Thank you. There's another question. This is from Paige, and this has come up many times. Even during your talk, you discuss managing people, and project management aspects. So while in academia, we are not directly taught project management skills, but yet we end up doing a lot of project management kind of things. And then since now you manage a team, so Paige wants to know what's some sort of like tips you have for practicing management strategies in grad school for undergrads or grad students.
That's I've worked really with a lot of question,
yeah. I've worked with so many undergrads, and it was just like first time it was a blunder. I wish I had known better, and then you get better. But then I wish there was some training. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of like the project management, I think you got to give yourself a little more credit. Like PhDs, we do this all the time, and you know, maybe to varying degrees of success. And I think you learn to manage things over time. But you know, for managing large projects, right? Anytime you're doing, if you have multiple things going on in the lab on a given week, right? You're in some way scheduling things out and planning what's going to happen what day, and that all falls under the umbrella of project management. So for that, I would say more you can do to like come up with an organizational system for yourself for that type of thing is super useful. Again, there are free tools online. We use something here called Asana, which is like a task manager. There's a number of different tools out there. Anything you can do to you know, plan your week out ahead of time, or you know, if you lay out a timeline, if you have two overlapping projects that maybe you'll be doing two different things this month, plan out what's going to happen on what day. That the practice of doing that will help you really see what you have room, like what days you'll have actually extra room to do things, what days you might be busy. That's very useful. From the perspective of managing people, I would say, if you're given lots of opportunities potentially to manage either, undergrads or junior graduate students who have joined the lab. What I would say is try to be as intentional as you can about those relationships, right? A lot of times, I think it's easy to fall into a situation where like you're focused on your own thing and you're like, oh yeah, there's this other person on the side I'm supposed to be helping. But again, if you can take that same approach to organize things in such a way where you're like, okay, great, this week, this person is going to work on X, Y, and Z, and I expect them to, at the end of the week, have produced 1, 2, and 3, produced these things, right? And so manage kind of timelines and expectations in both directions, right? Communicate with that with them, and kind of practice that process of saying, great, we're going to meet on Monday and Thursdays, and we can discuss this, and here's what I expect to see. Obviously, you have to adjust things, but getting in the habit of making this kind of an intentional, regularized relationship where you, set goals and timelines and expectations is super useful. It's also useful just like mentorship experience, right? Consider your role there as helping them develop as a scientist. Right. So if you see that they have problems, be proactive in, at each meeting saying, is there anything that's going wrong? Can I help with anything? Are you struggling with anything? Or even addressing those things proactively. If you see challenges, kind of bring up, basically just spending some extra time in those circumstances where you're given the opportunity to supervise or mentor someone. Spend a little extra time to plan and to really engage in mentorship there. And I think that's great experience that will certainly, help you in applying to jobs in industry and help you once you actually get in those positions too.
Great. So we have a couple of more questions. Do you have a few more minutes to spare?
Yeah, I can say another.
I know you're at workplace. Okay, great. So Jake has a question. Jake said earlier, jump the gun. So oops, he says, I didn't mean to hit the send yet. But Jake wants to know, did you only see companies that were in exact same field as your graduate or postdoc studies? And how much flexibility do you think companies have for potential employees from different or similar fields? Like what about like orthogonal fields where your expertise might be unique to the company? That's another very good question.
Yeah, totally. In my particular circumstance, I knew, immunology kind of what I was interested in. And that happened to be, right. It also overlaps with some specific domain area expertise that a lot of companies wanted. So that worked out. I know a lot of people who are, where that wasn't the case, right? Maybe they had a skill set, maybe they're, did a lot of cell biology work and they could be working on basic cell biology questions or, some specific disease and end up working for a company that does something else. So I think there are two ways to look at it. One is there's some domain area expertise that can be useful. Sometimes companies want that, sometimes they don't really care. But a lot of times, and especially in industry positions, a lot of times people are looking for people with a particular technical skill set. So if you've done next-gen sequencing, on yeast, but there's someone who's looking for someone with expertise in next-gen sequencing to work on cardiac drugs, that might still be very relevant expertise, and they don't care that you worked on a different system. Again, same thing is true of biochemistry or cell biology or mass spectrometry, right? A lot of times the the technique is more what gets your foot in the door and what might be relevant to them at that time, as opposed to like the domain expertise. That said, if it's a protein purification position, protein engineering position, and you have no experience ever working with proteins, but you're in the same field, that probably won't cut it. So
Great.
A lot of the times it comes down to the experience.
Lauren has another question, which is again very important. She says that she's conducting informational interviews. I always shy away from asking about how much money, and I totally agree with that. Like your money, as you said, in academia is such a taboo topic. Nobody wants to talk about it. If you ask your PI is going to be like, well, if you want money, then go somewhere else. The academia doesn't have enough money. But it's a really good question that, how do you talk about money, like how much they make and different kind of positions? And yet said it is an important factor to consider in choosing a career path. Any advice on how to broach that topic when talking with people, especially in informational interviews?
Yeah, that's really challenging. I mean, I think, as much as I think people, I think there is still some hesitancy around money, and you don't want to send the wrong message to someone, especially if this could be a connection later on. So I think the circumstance in which I think it's okay to ask a little more concretely about money is if you know the person fairly well. But I think in an informational interview where this is your first or second contact with the person, I think probably I would not ask questions about like what salary do they make or that type of thing. What I can say is that there are a number of resources online that are super helpful. So Glassdoor.com is a website that's really helpful where you can look at, especially for bigger companies where there's just more data. People basically volunteer salary information in an anonymized way. And so you can say, what does a scientist two at Pfizer in San Francisco make? And it gives you a range. It gives you a range of both, there's base salary, there's like bonuses at the end of the year. There might be stock with some bigger companies. You can get information that way. There are also some kind of forums, there are Reddit channels where people talk about this type of information, questions on Quora, that type of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky. I think the best way to go about it, if you're not like really familiar with the person, is to try to look for these types of sources online and use that as a gauge.
Awesome. Yeah. So I did add some links in the chat about like project management and graduate debris, and also the Glassdoor. This is as John said, like, you might not get exact amount, but you'll get some sort of a range. And also use this when you're finally you've been offered and you're negotiating for the salary. Look up what's the market trend for like that position and what's the range. So never give an exact number that I want 80,000. That's it. I won't take anything less, because you're probably going to jeopardize your chances of actually getting the job. So just give them a range and let them sort of play with it, and then come back and then you can negotiate. So that was a very good advice. I have one last question from John, and which is again very important, because we've heard from people who coming from large companies, medium-sized companies, and startups, and we hear a lot of stuff about like startups have a lot of money because you're sort of building up, you wear many hats and tons of things and lots of experience. Is there any reason why you went into startup compared to large size companies?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think a lot of the motivation for me was this idea that I was interested in kind of more of what happens in a company than just my kind of narrow slice of the research. And so I think that that is certainly the case, that I get a little bit more visibility into things here. I can walk into our CEO's office and ask him questions about whatever, which is an interesting kind of set of kind of experiences, or you get more visibility of more different things. So that's part of it. And like I said, I also valued kind of being able to come in and make like a really big contribution to the team, right? So on our team, we have, maybe 7 people on the scientific team actually working in the lab, maybe 8. And there might be a week where, an experiment that one of our research associates who is, fresh out of undergrad a year ago, something like that, is doing an experiment that everybody's waiting on. She'll present in front of the whole company, and the, CEO and chief business officer will all be like really eager to see the results. So like that type of thing that, in a small organization, your contribution makes a huge difference, and everybody is kind of interested in hearing about it. So that type of thing, I think, really appealed to me. I think I also had what is, maybe a slightly misguided notion that at a big company I would be pigeonholed into doing one thing and nothing else, right? And not have room for creativity. I think maybe in some places, in some types of positions, that can be the case. But I think, as I've gone into it and talked with more people at who actually went to larger companies, from my same kind of cohort of grad school and postdoc, I think that's less the case than I thought it was. Again, certainly you'll have maybe different degrees of flexibility of how much control over you have over maybe what direction to go, or how much breadth you cover, versus like focusing on kind of a narrow slice of science. But I think in general, people coming in with PhD level experience, PhD background, you're given you're being hired for your critical thinking ability and for your creativity, for those types of skills. And so I think, maybe my fear about that was a little misguided. Certainly, yeah. So, things that I definitely like about a small company. At a small company, though, things are, hectic and chaotic. And if you decide, we're trying to raise money and what we're doing currently is not working, so we need to pivot a little bit or focus our efforts on this, you need to drop what you're doing and spend time on this for a little bit. Or, frankly, I think I didn't fully appreciate how, I assume, startups fail all the time, right? That people give numbers like, 10% of startups make it through, I don't know, whatever the statistic is. I don't think I fully realized that for, biosciences startups, that part of what could cause you to fail is not just that the science didn't work, which totally, we all know happens. I didn't realize that, there are some really mistakes in things completely unrelated to the science that could, make or break the decision for the company. And so anything that can rock the boat has a really big effect at a small company. So, a misstep by someone in management or a missed research deadline or something, those things can have real impacts. Whereas if you're at Genentech or Pfizer and your operating budget is huge, you can afford to miss some things. And it's slightly different levels of pressure in that way. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I think in a bigger company, right, you also have access to more resources potentially. That said, I think everything's like orders of magnitude different from academia. So when I came here, I was like, ooh, it would be nice to have this $100,000 instrument to be able to do this type of assay that we want to do. And they're like, great, let's demo it next week. And then great, let's purchase it the week after that since it worked out. So like it's a different scale entirely. And then I think going to a big pharma company can even be another, order of magnitude beyond that. So it's interesting.
Well, this is the end of all the questions. This was very useful. John, it's always pleasure to sit with you, whether it's bar or like a science-related topic or presenting in front of students and postdocs, life beyond PhD. I really appreciate you taking time out and staying a little extra to answer all the questions. Thank you very much
Absolutely.
again.
Yeah, really, really appreciate the opportunity to talk and hope people found it helpful.